Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So 4 years ago today, on a Friday, on the 15th of March in 2019, a lone gunman walked into a mosque in Christchurch that was preparing for Jummah, gunned down a load of Muslims. Then he followed it up with a second attack in a second masjid in Christchurch. And before he was stopped, he killed 51 people and injured 40 people. It shocked the world. Like the idea of an Islamophobic killer in a quiet city of Christchurch in New Zealand, it completely shook the world. And ever since, people have been trying to understand what happened, why is it happening. Lots of excuses have been given. Was he a lone wolf? Was he an inspired white supremacist? Etc., etc. So we're having a conversation today. We need to understand, if we really want to respect the victims, we need to understand what the heck happened. And so we've been looking into his influences, his inspirations. And Asma, I think one of the people who came up was Anders Breivik. So from New Zealand to Norway, how are these two people, how are these two incidents connected?
We have to understand the connection. We have to understand his connection to Anders Breivik, which under the Washington Post had an article that they were in contact with each other. Now, this was prior to Anders Breivik and his massacre that he carried out himself. Okay. So he had he carried out an Islamophobic attack on Norwegian children that were of Muslim, I think of Muslim heritage, or so was basically,
he attacked political activists from a political party that he believed was to blame for the influx of Muslims, non-Christians and so on. Yeah. So we'll go into this. Yeah. But yeah, he specifically targeted like young activists.
Definitely, they were only children.
Yeah. So what he did was he set off a bomb outside the headquarters of that political party, and he wasn't happy with how few people had been killed by the bomb. So he went with his backup plan of getting to this island where this political activists were having like a camp, a training camp or something. It
was just like a camping weekend, wasn't it?
Yeah, and he was dressed up as a police officer.
Yeah.
And so not only was he killing kids, he was dressed up as a police officer. He was saying to the kids who were startled, he attacked political activists.
You know, as a parent, when you just said that, like, my heart shook. Imagine, like, you can imagine, like, if something like this is happening and the children are running towards what they think is a safe person, and he then just go and kills them, like, that is just heart-wrenching. And you think you're doing this under the pretext of hate and racism, because Islamophobia, you know, is a type of racism. So as a parent, my heart just shook. And it didn't just end there, did it? Because this guy that carried out the Christchurch massacres did the exact same thing. He went into a masjid, although he wasn't dressed in police officers, you know, he wasn't satisfied with just a few people that he killed, that when he heard people groaning, he ran back in and shot at them again. And then when he came back out, he heard them groaning again, he went back and shot them again. And that's where the similarities are with the two of them. Like, their mindset was under of the pretext of white supremacy and of hate.
And he live streamed the whole thing as well, the Christchurch killer. So to understand what happened in Christchurch, make sure that it can't happen again. That's why we're talking about Anders Breivik, and today we're going to be talking about a book by Sindre Bangstad, Anders Breivik and the Rise of Islamophobia. So we've been reading over it over the past few weeks, and it does a fantastic job of really unpacking Anders Breivik. Where did he come from? Where does his ideology come from? And even though the book was published, I think, in 2014, it does help explain why 5 years after the book's published, what could have utilised, what could have facilitated, the attack in Christchurch. So, Asma, when you went through the book, what were your thoughts on what the author was saying in terms of where the Christchurch killer's ideology... Firstly, the ideology is shared.
Definitely.
So Anders Breivik's ideology, the Christchurch killer's ideology, where does it come from?
So it comes from... What the author is saying in this book is that it comes from a deep down racism and how it comes from how political parties embed this racism into people, because we're not born racist, are we? You know, we're not born hating other people or hating a religion or hating people of color. It comes from institutionalized racism, whether it is political parties or whether it is academic associations. And the one thing about this book is that he backs up everything he says. There's so much research in every single page he's put into this book, and that's the amazing part of it, because he's not just saying words, he's backing them up. And that aspect in the book where, you know, this, I said to you when I was reading this book, there is so much to unpack, because he has backed up every single one of his points.
And like one of the points that he mentioned, something that had been kind of growing since 2001 and over the decades leading up to Anders Breivik's attack in 2011, was this concept of Eurabia. Sort of like, it's the nickname given to this sort of like conspiracy theory of Muslims taking over Europe, basically. Coming from Arabia, taking over Europe, it's nicknamed Eurabia. And where did, like, basically this concept was something that was given airtime, something that's given breathing space to grow and grow by media pundits and so on. And this helped kind of normalize, or at least spread, this point of view. And obviously the idea of saying, hey, look, there's an external threat and it wants to take over Norway, take over Europe, etc., etc. Yeah, the boogeyman. And how do you respond to a boogeyman? By attacking the boogeyman. So it's like people like Anders Breivik and people of his, like, whatever grouping he saw himself as, they saw themselves as defenders. Yeah, so he said that outright. Yeah, so they saw themselves as defenders against Muslim encroachment. And it's not a problem when, you know, you have a fringe lunatic individual or a group of individual lunatics. The real problem comes when, as you said, it becomes institutionalized. So we had ahead of Anders Breivik's attack in 2011, the Norwegian security services were warned by international services like Global Shield that, hey, look, there's a high chance of this guy, right-wing extremists and so on. I mean, do you see this as something that's still going on in terms of institutionalizing, legitimizing Islamophobia?
We see it every single day.
Something that had been kind of growing since 2001.
Back in 2001, it wasn't that transparent, but you can see it now. Like, you can see the institutionalized racism, and as you say, like the whole Eurabia thing, if it goes unchecked, and this is something that the author says a lot in the book, that if you allow these people a platform and you allow them to their ideology to go unchecked, then hate like this will just start growing and growing and growing and growing, and it won't stop until it becomes checked and until it becomes marginalized, until it becomes like someone says, okay, stop, you can't say that. Because the one thing that he mentions is about freedom of speech. Now, when is freedom of speech having to be stopped as freedom of speech? Like we saw it this weekend with Gary Lineker. You know, he can say whatever he wants about Qatar and their human rights and this, that and the other, and attack, you know, the Qataris. And
so what you're saying is that there's, and you're saying this, and this is also connected in the book. In terms of political convenience, it's, you know, freedom of speech is connected. It's not freedom of speech, it's allowed speech. Speech that's allowed is connected to political agenda. So what you said, you know, just last weekend. Yeah, so last weekend, Gary Lineker, he said something that the government didn't want to allow him to say, etc., etc. And what Sindre Bangstad's been saying in this book, apologies if I'm mispronouncing his name, what he's saying in this book is it was so politically convenient for the right-wing political party and right-wing media to allow this fringe, which had a supporter base, had a voter base, etc., etc., let them vent, let them say what they wanted to say, because it was seen as better to let them vent and take part in democracy than to silence them and to push them into an explosive, silent fringe. But then what happens is that it poisons the discourse. It poisons, it normalizes.
they couldn't allow what he said to go unchecked. Because if it did, it will mean that it will then turn into a snowball effect. So people are going to start joining this. No, refugees should be welcome. They're not threats to society. And it will just turn bigger and bigger and bigger. So what the BBC and the government have done is stop that. And they can do it. And we can see that they can do it. And what they're doing with this whole Islamophobia, they're not allowing it to be checked, and what they're allowing to do is become a big massive snowball that one day things like this will happen. You know, the attack in Oslo, the attack on Christchurch is absolutely disgusting, like, and if it could have been stopped, it should have been stopped, but because it's so politically convenient, they're not going to allow it to stop.
And we've talked about political convenience for the right wing, but there is also
a kind of political convenience. It's not to the same extent, same amount and so on, but the left wing as well. So when I say left wing, I mean, you know, liberal, progressive, whatever a person might want to call themselves if they see themselves on the left wing. So again, something that's commonly said about Muslims, Islam, etc., etc. This is a religion that hates freedom of speech. This is a censorial, it shuts down speech, it shuts down opinion, and so on. And so, therefore, anyone who criticizes that aspect of Islam is doing the liberals and progressives a favor. Like, hey, look, I'm someone who believes in complete open free speech. I'm going to criticize Islam's censorious ways. And, okay, fine, you have an opinion, you want to state it publicly, and you allow yourself to be criticized for it, fine, whatever. But then what that does is that that opens the door to things like, look at the headscarf. The headscarf is a physical manifestation of the censorious nature of Islam. Look at, this behavior or that behavior of the Muslims. This is another way that Islam shuts down on free speech and free behavior and so on. So left wing, right wing, there's a problem either way in terms of how Muslims and Islam is approached. That was one of my takeaways. What are your thoughts on that?
So you said it exactly as it is, and I think touching on what you said with the whole Islam thing, Islam doesn't teach us freedom of speech. Islam teaches us you be kind with your words, you respect other people's religion, you respect what they believe in. That's why when they attack Islam, or when they burn the Quran, or when they attack our Prophet ﷺ, it hurts us so much, because if we're taught growing up from the day we were born that you are to respect other people's religions and you respect other people's ways of life, and people then go and attack us for it, that's why it hurts so much. So when people become crazy about it, that's why they become crazy about it.
The double standard nature of it is I'd echo a little bit of what you'd say, and I'd add on top of it. So like it does sting twice for Muslims when our red lines are crossed. And I did an interview with this about this on LBC just some days ago. And basically, like, when Islamophobes, I'm not talking about critics, I'm not talking about academics who have a fair criticism, when idiots who basically just want to insult Muslims go ahead and insult Muslims, it might be, the dignity of our Prophet ﷺ, it might be any other red line that Muslims have. For us, it stings twice, because it's not only are you crossing our red lines, but when we cross your red lines, you silence us, you criminalize us, you label us as extremists, etc. What red lines am I talking about? Look, school kids talking about Palestine, or let's say a Muslim person who's a part of Labour or Conservatives or whatever, if they criticize Israel, they're kicked out of the party.
That's it. Yeah.
If a mosque imam who's trying to educate his congregation, and he wants to talk about what does jihad mean, what does khilafah mean, etc., etc., he's going to end up on some blacklist, some watch list or whatever. So it cuts us twice, and that's why I really, really believe that Muslims, instead of being advocates for some kind of like a blasphemy law, advocates for more censorship or so on, we actually have a vested interest in seeking more freedom of speech. In just it's not that hard to turn the tables. Like, you want to cross my red lines? Well, I think that British foreign policy, etc., this, that, and the other. And that is something that is much more meaningful. Like, that is much more meaningful. Stop making the conversation about how easily offended Muslims are. That is so superficial. That is so superficial. If you're really an advocate for free speech, if you're even a free speech absolutist, which sounds really cool, but most people are hypocrites when they say it. But if you really are a free speech advocate, then yeah, you better be ready to listen to what Muslims have to say about what is really important, what is really big in British politics, domestic politics, foreign policies, and so on. But you're not ready to hear it. So what you try to do is you try to distract the public away from the fact that Muslims have a lot to say, to the fact that to your opinion on why Muslims need to be silenced. Yeah. And it comes through in the book as well, basically, like in the closing pages of the book, like when it talks about solutions and, what can we do to stop something terrible like Anders Breivik's attack or the Christchurch attack happening again. What were your thoughts on sort of like the close or the solutions they offer?
Perfect sense. It would make a really good politician. It would make a really good MP. But do you know what really is upsetting about he offered so many solutions and sensible solutions, but he was absolutely annihilated in Norwegian press, and he was obliterated by MP, especially the right-wing MP, saying, he's talking a load of nonsense and stuff like that. But, he's the one person who actually came to the table with a lot of common sense. If I'm going to say that, yeah, it's a lot of common sense. So, unless you're actually going to come to the table with a lot of political solutions, because this is a political solution that it does need, and especially stopping attacks like this, because the attack in Oslo, none of the right-wing politicians wanted to take, although he used them. Anders Breivik was really clever, and he used this, these politicians inspired me and this and the other, and none of them wanted to take responsibility for that, so they all pushed back. It was like, no, that's not what we meant, but hang on a minute, you said it in the first place, so now you should take ownership and actually apologize for that. And you don't see any of the politicians doing that. They've said some really stupid, messed up stuff, but yet none of them have been made to apologize. Like, again, Gary Lineker, what they want him to do is apologize for what he said, for standing up for refugees, when all he's doing is being a good human being. And that's the difference. Like, if you're being a good human being, you're made to apologize for having a good human being moral, but yet these right-wing politicians are not willing to accept saying that freedom is perfect sense.
In terms of what the author's coming to in his conclusion is that freedom of speech is destructive when it's not. He talks so much about political parties, movements, etc., utilizing narratives, utilizing opportunities to speak and so on to build up a legitimacy. What do I mean by that? By giving air to speak. What do I want to say? By being allowed to constantly push a narrative rather than just information points and so on. There's a difference between pushing a narrative and pushing information and so on. And by allowing these fringe narratives to be pushed, it just pushes them closer and closer into the mainstream. They do need to be dissected, and he doesn't spell it out, but he kind of insinuates that by saying that this is a right-wing problem, he's kind of insinuating that the left wing has a responsibility to counter the narrative and so on. But I would go, my opinion on his opinion, I would go so far as to say it's up to the Muslims to counter the narrative, to dissect it, to break it down. Because if it's the left wing countering the right-wing narrative, firstly, there are parts of Islam, etc., that the left-wing liberals, progressives might not agree with. So what are they going to do? Are they going to compartmentalize their replies and so on? But secondly, if it's a left-wing response, whether it's a left-wing party or grouping or whatever, then the right wing just points can easily frame it as, oh, this is a left-wing idea. The left-wing are allowing Muslims to do this and that.
Yeah.
So Muslims, we need to sort of like free ourselves from this dichotomy, from this splitting, from that, that political divide, left, right. We are independent of that.
Exactly.
And so we need to have our advocates, we need to have our researchers, we need to have our speakers and so on, who can just cut through the crap and say, look, this is the problem you have with Muslims. A, B, and C, well, this is X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
So, for example, just one simple example, what I was just saying a minute before about the Muslims should be one of the biggest advocates of free speech because we've got a lot to say. That flips the whole thing on the head.
Exactly. But if you're going to say free speech, but yet cut off this, that, and the other, say, oh, you can't say that, or this person can't say that, and this person can't say that, how is it free speech? But yet you can say everything you want against Islam, because that's under the pretext of freedom of speech. But yet if you say anything against the establishment's ideology, then you're cut off straight away. And you're not only just cut off, look, they've taken him off the Match of the Day, they've taken his contract under, what was it? They're looking into his contract until he signs waivers about his social media and this, that, and the other. Hang on a minute, why? I thought we're all allowed freedom of speech. So if freedom of speech isn't freedom of speech for everybody, then why is it only allowed to push a certain agenda? And we have to, as Muslims, take ourselves away from that. We're living in the West. You can't turn around and say we can't get involved in politics, we can't get involved in this, and we can't get involved in that, when it's actually the establishment and politics that are pushing an anti-Islamic rhetoric, and we're in the middle of it.
Yeah, so we've seen for ourselves. We saw in Norway, we saw in Christchurch, we're seeing in Palestine, we're seeing in India, the power of Islamophobic narratives. We're seeing the consequence of Muslims not trying to push back against Islamophobia in politics and media. That has to be the lesson that we take away from this. Muslims cannot afford to ignore the Islamophobia that's propagated in media and politics. So I want to quickly talk about next month's Information is Power book club review. We're going to be reviewing a book called Minarets in the Mountains. Let's see if I can hold it up. Minarets in the Mountains. So why are we looking into this next month?
So it's just going on from what we're talking about with the whole Eurabia situation and how Islam is a part of Europe. It got as far as Paris, it's got as far as Bulgaria, and how in Muslims and in Bosnia, and how Muslims are a part of day-to-day life in Islam. And the author himself, he travels around. That's why it's called Minarets in Mountains. Like, he travelled around a lot in Bosnia, and obviously we have to understand what happened in Bosnia, and how an ideology was allowed to grow, and because of that there was a genocidal maniac who thought he could try to take them all out. So it's more about how Islam and in Europe are a part of integrational.
Alright, excellent. So Jazakallah khair for that, and inshallah please do tune in next month as we review this book. Read this book along with us and join the conversation.
Definitely.
Let
And
us know.
remember,
And if you have read Sindre Bangstad and the Rise of Islamophobia, comment with your thoughts on the book, on what the author was trying to say, and what you think of what the author was trying to say. Jazakallah khair. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
remember to like, share, and follow.